Welcome everyone to this training video for Belgrade WUDC 2022. My name is Macharia and I have been asked by the CAs to give a talk about whip speeches and common mistakes usually made when evaluating whip speeches. So the structure of how I'm going to do this is: first, we're going to discuss the role of the whip. Secondly, we're going to discuss new material and how to credit or what not to credit from what the whip says with regards to new material. Thirdly, we're going to talk about some of the common mistakes that are made when judging whip speeches. So let's start with the first part, which is what is the role of the whip and what can they do and what can't they do. So here I'll just read out what the manual says, which I'm sure you've all read. It does clearly explain what the limitations and what the whip can do within their speeches. So first, they can bring new defenses to arguments already made. So if the member makes an argument and it's responded to by the member of opposition, the government whip is allowed to defend against some of the responses that the government member of opposition did bring. So this is what we call new defenses. So basically defenses against your arguments, either through maybe a POI that was also asked by opening opposition to your member of government. You can bring new defenses. Two, they can bring new explanation to previously made arguments. So if a member makes an argument, they are allowed to add maybe some new explanations to that, which also could mean new mechanisms to prove the same point. So anything new that advances a previously made argument is allowed to be made by the whip. The third thing they're allowed to bring is new rebuttals. This should be fairly obvious. The role of the whip is to respond, so they can bring new responses over and above what the member said in their speech to against either the opening opposition or the closing opposition. They are allowed to bring new responses and new rebuttals. They can bring new examples to support new and existing arguments. This almost in a sense goes hand in hand with the new mex and new explanations that we talked about earlier. If the case is about efficiency and you have a good example about why probably a place that used the case that a case study of the case you're running, you can bring those new examples to support existing arguments. You can also bring new explanations regarding the impact or prioritization of existing lines of argumentation. So, for example, an impact has already been made by the member of government or member of opposition, depending on where you are or which whip speaker you are. You are allowed to bring in new metrics of weighing as to why you think this argument is important. So maybe your argument had, I don't know, an impact about minority stakeholders being benefited, and then you weighed it out on vulnerability. You can add a new explanation as to why this impact should be prioritized, maybe with a new mech like, I don't know, long-termism, short-termism, time frame weighing, probability weighing. You can bring in new metrics of weighing to already existing impacts to show why they should be prioritized in the debate. So you're not limited to sticking to the framework or the weighing that was set in the member speech, assuming it was done. You can add new explanations regarding why an impact should be prioritized, or already made arguments that have already been weighed. You can add new metrics on new lines of, I don't know, weighing. The last thing you can do is anything the other side can reasonably be expected to understand that the team intended in the member's speech. So I thought about this for a while and I asked, why did they put this sentence here? This usually comes as a situation where sometimes you said something in the member speech and it's completely misconstrued by the other side. You can come and clarify what exactly your team made. This is to ensure that judges don't take it as new material when you're clarifying something and maybe just make it sound like it's a bit different, but maybe it's just a clarification to something the other side should have reasonably, almost in a sense, deducted from what you already said. So these are the rules of the whip, the role of the whip that is explained in the WUDC manual. And now we'll move into analyzing how these things interact with real life situations in debate. So the first thing we then look at is new material. What is new material in the whip speech, and how do we credit or discredit new material? So the manual says something, and I'll just read it and then we'll go into the application of it. It says, judges should consider whether or not making the claim raises a new issue or new approach to winning the debate on the existing issue, to which the other side has very little or no little ability to respond to maybe that new issue or the new approach raised in the whip speech. So based on what the manual seems to be saying, new material comes when the whip creates, almost in a sense, a new issue in the debate that was not already existing. There's also a second level, which is a new approach to winning. So what is new material? It is those two things. One, a new issue that was not previously in the debate, or two, a new approach to winning the debate on an existing issue, and now that's what is usually credited as new material. Notice that not all new material is generally to be discredited, not always. For example, when we talked about the role of the whip in the previous section, we said whips are allowed to bring new explanations or new impacts or new weighing to already existing arguments. So that does mean that they are almost, in a sense, raising a new approach to winning the debate. That doesn't therefore mean that when they add new weighing, that's new material should be discredited. What happens and how we look at whip speeches, especially with regards to new material, is when the speaker adds an exhaustive amount of new material that clearly leads the debate in a different path, or so in a sense creates a new issue in the debate, then it's in a sense new material. What do I mean? Maybe let me clarify this as an example. If your case is about efficiency, right? For example, you are running a case about efficiency and why, for example, the introduction or the development of AI would add efficiency, I don't know, to the workforce. And then your whip speech then almost in a sense abandons efficiency in the workforce and then starts talking about efficiency to things like new actors, new stakeholders, adding new impacts maybe on vulnerable individuals, talking about why the efficiency will fund, healthcare or social protection schemes for those who become unemployed. All that introduction of new mechanisms, new stakeholders, new framing, new weighing, sort of in a sense dissolves the ability, or almost in a sense reduces the ability of the other team to engage and leads the debate on a different path, which is in a sense against the role of the whip. So if you want to know the difference between the whip performing their role of maybe repatching, maybe something that was responded to, adding a make to something that was already exhaustively explained, and a speaker who has almost in a sense created a new argument, you must in a sense use your intuition here as a judge to understand, has the material added by the whip completely shifted this trajectory of this argument? Is it new completely? Because when you add new framing, you add new actors, you use different mechanisms that are heading us in a different direction, that in a sense becomes a new argument or new material that should not be credited. So this is something that sometimes is very subjective. However, the manual has tried its best to create objective metrics, which is that when the issue is completely new or the approach to winning has completely shifted, we ought to credit that as new material, and therefore that material should not be weighed when evaluating where the team in closing ends up in the debate. The last thing I'll say here is that when crediting new material, you must again pay attention to what the whip has done in their speech and whether or not it's just an extension of what the member said, which is now the other side of the case. Sometimes whips do add new material that is not in essence to be discredited. When it doesn't change the approach to winning, for example, the approach to winning was always on vulnerability. Maybe that's something they explained. It doesn't change that. It just adds new mechanisms to that and framing that probably brings that. That's not something that we then discredit. But in the case where it completely shifts the path to victory and almost in a sense creates a new issue in the debate, as I've explained. So I think the best way of putting this is, if they add new mechanisms and maybe new examples, that's not new material. But if they add new mechanisms, new framing, new weighing, new examples, all that then, in a sense, is building a new argument, therefore should be discredited. So judges must be careful and intuitive when trying to evaluate just how much new material has been brought and to what extent does it change the trajectory of the argument. So again, let me just patch it up by saying there are only two justifications or two ways to look at this. If we bring up a new issue that's new, or a new argument, that's something that should be discredited. Or if the approach to winning on the same argument completely shifts, then that almost in a sense does discredit the entire section or that new approach that has been brought about by the whip. However, a new approach does not mean new weighing. It just means when you completely change the trajectory of the argument to being about something else, which it was not. Again, most of this will likely apply in a case-by-case basis. You have to be very careful and in the moment to understand just what has happened and at what of the two, philosophy should you apply in that situation. Should I discredit completely, or is this maybe not changing the issue or the approach to winning? The next thing I'll talk about here is something or common mistakes that are usually made by judges when evaluating whip speeches. One, is there a difference between the government whip and the opposition whip? And this is something that usually comes up a lot because of the transition of speakers from world schools to BP. In BP, this is fairly certain that government whip and opposition whip are the same. So government whip is not allowed to bring new material and opposition whip is not allowed to bring new material. This is a blanket approach that applies to all situations. Please do not credit government whips or say that government whips have leeway to add new material because the opposition whip has the ability to respond. In BP, that does not apply. In world schools, maybe some judges can get away with it. What other mistakes do judges tend to make a lot when evaluating whip speeches? I have a couple of mistakes that judges tend to make. One, we must always distinguish between knifing and weighing, because this is largely a problem and an epidemic in mostly developing circuits, probably the one I'm from. When teams bring up new weighing to justify why their material is superior to their opening, that is not a knife. Some judges, and in some ways I've listened to, judges tend to believe that when a closing team tries to distinguish itself in a manner by showing superiority or showing why their opening was maybe not as good, that is considered knifing. We think that this is usually a mistake that people tend to make, especially in developing circuits when evaluating whip speeches, especially when they are weighing on the bench. Please always know the difference between knifing and weighing. They are allowed to weigh over their opening. They are allowed to show why they're better than their opening. Strategically, this is not a mistake and should not be considered knifing. Two, we always need to understand that the whip is allowed to bring new material, which is what we were talking about earlier. So sometimes we don't credit or we refuse to credit whip speeches or some new material brought in whip speeches, yet it's just advancing a case that's already there. So for example, if the member explained an argument, gave its mechanisms, and even impacted it well, sometimes the whip, maybe in response to what has happened or just to build up the argument, can add new framing or add an impact to that argument. That is not something that should be discredited to the extent that it's been brought in the whip speech and should have come in the member speech. A lot of judges tend to believe that the whip should not be advancing the case at any point and should just stick to everything that was said in the member speech. That is not true. The whip can advance the case. They can bring new mechanisms. They can bring new weighing. They can bring new framing. The problem becomes, as we've discussed, when they bring all these things together and that brings up either a new issue or a new approach to victory, completely shifting the direction of the argument, that's when it then becomes discredited. What other mistakes do we make in whip speeches that we should be very careful about? One, we tend to ignore opening material when listening to whip weighing material. This is something I've noticed a lot. Whips most of the time tend to be very assertive, and especially as judges, we tend to ignore preemptive frameworks that exist in the debate. So for example, this probably comes from just a closing bias, or I don't know, maybe they just spoke much closer to the end and that's what you remember. This largely happens when an opening makes their case and explains why they believe their case to be very important and they weigh out their material. And then the closing comes and says, oh no, here are other reasons why our material is extremely important, without direct engagement as to why the metric set in opening are probably defeated by the metric set in closing. This is something that many judges tend to ignore. If your opening weighed the case, the whip can't just come and assertively weigh, for example, oh no, we helped the most vulnerable stakeholder, but opening had shown that probably a large majority of people are helped. So whips must also engage on preemptive frameworks justifying why their material then should be prioritized over the material that came in the opening team's speech. This largely is a mistake many judges make. They ignore opening speeches or opening team frameworks and just credit whips for assertive weighing most of the time, without really looking at whether or not there was something else they should have been engaging on. The other thing that tends to be a large mistake we make when crediting whip speeches largely comes with speaker scores. So whips have roles that they ought to fulfill in the debate. This looks like, as we've discussed, they do respond to the other team's case through engagement. They do add new material and defend their team case through maybe new mechanisms, new impacts, new rebuttals, new examples, whatever it is. We think, probably this is me coming from experience, many speakers either do one of two things that I think are extremely damaging. One, they either completely ignore, not completely ignore, they either completely undercredit the whip speech because of something I mentioned earlier, which is believing that, oh, all this was said in the member. So if the whip sometimes sounds a bit like they're using members' material to respond to others, we don't credit them enough. Or we sometimes overcredit whip speeches to the extent that we ignore what their members contributed, and everything they say sometimes gets overcredited to the extent that it almost, in a sense, again, it's a proximity bias to the end. What I'm trying to say here with regards to speaker scores is whips have a burden of advancements. And when deciding the speaker scores of the whip, we must look at the advancement made by the whip. Some whips come on the stage and for word, do not advance either of the cases. All their rebuttals have been made either in opening or by their member. All the summations they are making are just repetitions of what the member's case were. Yet we want to overcredit that case by giving it high scores just because the team did well. We must look at individual performances of speakers sometimes when determining the speaker scores of whips, looking at what their contribution was to the round. So don't either undercredit a whip because maybe you believed that the new material they brought should have all been in opening, therefore they should have not said what they said, or they didn't bring much to the debate. Or we overcredit them because, you know, as I've already explained, sometimes we listen to the whip speech. It's a complete replica of everything that has happened in the debate with no advancement, yet we are overcrediting it and giving it a lot of scores. So please be careful when looking at the speaker scores of the whips. Pay attention to what advancements, and I think that's what I wanted to say here. Whips have a role to play. They don't just come regurgitate everything that has happened in the debate and then we give them high scores. They must contribute. Otherwise, you score them like you would any other speaker, and that does play into the judgment that comes. And then lastly, we always have to pay attention to this issue of new material, which is a common mistake we've talked about already before. So there's no point of repeating a lot about this. Is it new material? Is it not? To be fair, it is always going to be a discussion. The objective metrics have already been given to you. Is it a new argument or new issue, or is it completely changing the approach to which, the path to victory of that argument? If it does, then it should almost, in a sense, not be justified. Lastly, this is the last thing. In cases of new material, this is a common mistake judges make. They tend to completely ignore the entire contribution without necessarily evaluating which part of that contribution was new material and which part can remain. If there's a part that you believe to be new material, it doesn't mean that that entire case or that entire rebuttal or that entire extension is completely gone. You must still credit that which was not new when evaluating what new material is. You just take out that part that you believe to be new. Everything else still stands. You don't cut off the whole argument, the whole extension, the whole point of analysis because it had a point of it which was new material. So when evaluating new material, do not, and I repeat, do not cut off the entire point of analysis. Just weed out that specific part that is new material and keep everything else. After that, evaluate everything holistically based on that material that we believe is not new material, and do not just discredit it because a part of it had new material. So I think that largely covers a lot of what I wanted to say in this. There are a few other, of course, mistakes that judges tend to make that you can also look into, which is like a straw man bias, which is a lot of whips tend to, you know, sometimes not engage opening teams very well. And in evaluating them, we tend to always, believe what the whip is saying, especially when they're strawmanning other teams' cases. Don't just believe the whips. Like whip speakers are sly speakers. speakers. They are very silver-tongued speakers. Sometimes they get away with a lot, actually get away with murder, because many a times maybe we are not paying attention to what happened 40 minutes ago in the debate. So good note-taking will always help you get away from the strawman bias of whips trying to do almost in a sense dilute what another team said, or in a sense just not capture correctly what was said. This helps in evaluating engagement, because if whips are almost in a sense straw manning, you cannot completely credit that engagement as it does not holistically respond to what the other team says. So this again, I think comes again from many judges just having a closing bias or just a proximity bias to the last speeches that were made, not paying attention to what happened earlier. So always evaluate whip speeches holistically. When the whip is speaking and they're responding to someone, have somewhere where you're paying attention to what they're responding to, so that you don't almost in a sense get persuaded by this silver-tongued, sly, yet amazing friends of ours called whips, who sometimes get away with murder by strawmanning their openings or not engaging robustly to what the other team said. So this is something that, I mean, that happens. And I think the last thing I'll say, probably I had a bit more mistakes than I had anticipated. Clash identification and prioritization. So you also need to evaluate whip speeches holistically, not just by evaluating the whip speech on how many clashes the whip showed they won, but how many, or how the whip justified that the clashes they won were the most important. Whips justifying why they win all clashes doesn't necessarily win them the debate. You must almost, in a sense, evaluate the debate on the metrics, frameworks, or the engagement that happened in the debate. What were the most important issues? Always pay attention to that. Whip clash identification and whip clash, basically the whipping of clashes, should not only be evaluated on the number of clashes won, rather by the priority or the, I don't know, the importance of the clashes that the whip justifies to have been won. Other than that, I think that was a majority of it. The mistakes are quite many. We talked about the strawman bias, new material, how to spot it and how to evaluate it. We've talked about clashes and how to always use the priority metric rather than just numbers and saying who won more. Lastly, we've also talked about how the distinction between knifing and weighing, and how developing circuits should learn how to understand that whips can weigh over their openings. Members can do the same. It's not knifing. The issue of response bias and whether or not, whips can be allowed to advance the member's case, and why we should not, almost in a sense, punish whips because they're adding new materials and they should be credited for that. And the speaker score issue of always check the advancement the whip has made and credit them individually as a speaker, not when they just regurgitate everything without much advancement, yet we give them over crediting. That's my speech, or that's my presentation. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I do wish you all the best at Belgrade WUDC. Thank you.